This is episode 2 in a larger series on Germany winning World War II. But don't worry, you don't have to watch them in order. To quickly catch you up, in this series we will explore the common ways that people have Germany win World War II, or at least to have them get closer to it. We will explore how realistic those options are and how much of an impact they will have on German odds of victory. The previous episode dealt with weakening the British, while this episode will deal with keeping the US out of the war. Now, in order for any scenario to truly count as a full victory for the Germans, to me, a couple factors need to be accomplished. Eastern Europe needs to be under German hegemony, the power of France and Britain broken. Russia needs to be conquered, unable to effectively mount offensives anymore, and, importantly, the United States needs to be out of the war. This episode will obviously focus on this third point. But why do I think that this is so crucial? Well, because Germany could compete pretty well with the British and the Soviets in terms of military and industry, especially early on in the war. But this is simply not the case between Germany and the United States. The United States has multiple times the German industry, better scientists, more resources, a healthier budget, and a more meritocratic state and military. America entering the war in basically any capacity guarantees an eventual German defeat, as their military involvement, especially in combination with Britain, causes a near guaranteed defeat in the Mediterranean, while their air force production will allow them to eventually reach air supremacy. This is important because Germany, and we will explore this in a later video, was nowhere near achieving a nuclear weapon. If America is in the war, the moment the Manhattan Project succeeds, Germany is doomed. So that raises the obvious question, how can Germany keep the US from entering the war for as long as possible? We start with an absolute classic. What if Germany just doesn't declare war on America? This is a major point, often discussed online, and it makes a whole load of sense. For context, after Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the US officially joined the Pacific War, fighting side by side with the British against the Japanese. But, crucially, this didn't immediately commit them to a war against the Germans. In fact, America's high command, for just a little while, was a slight bit worried. With America's public anger so squarely aimed at the Japanese, how could FDR ever convince Congress to go to war against Germany as well? Well, luckily for us, Germany made this question quite easy to answer, as they declared war on the US mere days after Pearl Harbor. The US and the Germans were now at war, and within months, American forces would be participating in the African theater of the conflict. So, the thought often goes, if Germany just doesn't declare war on America, all is well, and America is forced to just sit out on the sideline. But let's first explore why the Germans even declared war on the Americans. What was the thought process, and what was the motivation to do something so unbelievably stupid? Were they so delusional that they actually wanted this war with the Americans? Well, not exactly. There were, of course, plans for an eventual conflict with the US, but this was scheduled until after Europe was fully conquered. Instead, from the German perspective, the declaration of war against the US after Pearl Harbor was a mere formality. After all, the US had long since been supporting the British via Lend-Lease, American ships were actively fighting German submarines in the Atlantic, and the American government's opinion about the war in Europe was quite clear. Albeit in a limited capacity, the US was arguably already in the war by this point. Besides this, Germany was in a very public alliance with Japan. They, correctly, realized that this would be swiftly utilized by the US government to start justifying American entry into the European war as well. Beyond that, and admittedly, this is the weakest of the points I've seen, by not declaring war on America, Germany feared that America would focus all of their efforts on swiftly obliterating Japanese, as nobody held any pretenses that Japan could win that war in the long term. Imagine America neutralizing Japan by 1943 or 1944, while keeping the Soviets and the British fighting through ever-increasing Lend-Lease. Now Germany is down an ally in Asia, while the Americans are free to start looking to enter the European war with their full strength. Finally then, there was also the matter of sheer arrogance. With the Germans very much expecting an American declaration of war in the not-so-distant future, they simply wanted to be the ones that actually did the declaring. After all, as the German foreign minister opined, great powers do not wait to have war declared on them. And so it was, and Germany declared war on the US. Now, it is far from unthinkable that the Germans would just not. I'd probably rate it around a 6 in terms of realism, if not higher. The question now though is, would it actually matter? As I just explained, in many ways the United States was already in the war. They were fighting the Germans on the seas, they were now fighting Japan, an open German ally, and they were doing so side by side with the British. The president, Roosevelt, was well known for his efforts to get the US more involved in the war. And regardless of Germany officially declaring war, he is now undeniably in a far better position to actually make it happen. Immediately upon entering the war against Japan, his administration would intensify propaganda about the German-Japanese alliance, arguing that war with Germany was needed to fully end the Japanese threat. Lend-Lease would be stepped up even further. Any losses in the Atlantic to German submarines get far more media attention. Churchill and Roosevelt meet on the regular, officially to discuss the war on Japan and other security concerns. It is very much an open question when Roosevelt might convince Congress to declare war on Germany, but with every passing day and every German attack in the Atlantic, the likelihood does increase. Besides, even in a completely optimal scenario for Germany, where Roosevelt greatly struggles to join the war, Lend-Lease would not decrease. In fact, Roosevelt likely gets a far freer hand in sending support to especially Britain, but the Soviets too. Even if America doesn't enter the war, don't expect battles like that of Stalingrad to go differently, as the Soviets would salvage that way before the US was significantly involved in the European conflict. Similarly, the African theater is not suddenly won by the Germans, though their collapse could be delayed, depending on if and how Britain would launch Operation Torch by themselves. So there is very much a debate to be had about the potential impact of this change. In a worst case scenario for Germany, it could just be a 5. Relatively soon after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt manages to join the war. In the best case scenarios for Germany, the impact jumps up to around a 7, if it takes Roosevelt up to 1943 to actually join the war. Regardless, most do generally agree that this would not be enough to completely prevent American entry into the war. Now, an alteration and expansion on this idea would be, what if Japan just didn't do Pearl Harbor at all? This is an idea with a lot more potential for the Germans. After all, the American public isn't shocked out of their isolation, and Roosevelt will have a much harder time convincing the American public and Congress to go fight a war for Britain. Of course, it is doubtful that this is a war-winning change on its own. Nothing has changed about Roosevelt's current level of support for the Allies, the Lend-Lease to Britain and the USSR, and America's participation in the Atlantic. Again, even without Pearl Harbor, the Germans are unlikely to win at Stalingrad, and the British could, on their own, likely still win in Africa and maybe even invade Italy. The war takes significantly longer and is so much more brutal, until either the Americans join the war in its later years, not unlike what happened in World War I, or the Soviets, through American steel, push back the Germans. Still, the situation for the Allies is dangerous. Add in a couple of other changes, weakening Britain or the Soviets, and the Germans could see a victory emerge in these conditions. I think I will rate no Pearl Harbor at around a 7 or an 8 in terms of impact. The main problem with it though is that it's very unrealistic. Japan is where our issue lies. We all know that their government was filled with insane, genocidal, horrific militaristic types. But their planning for an attack on the West only began relatively late. After all, by nearly all metrics, it was a very stupid idea. Everyone, including most in Japan, knew that the US would crush Japan in nearly every way. Admiral Yamamoto, the brain behind the Japanese naval war, famously quipped, In the first 6 to 12 months of war with America and Britain, I can run wild and win victory upon victory. After that, I have no hope of success. So, if this was the prevailing sentiment, then why did Japan attack the Americans anyways? Well, quite simply put, because they had no other choice. When Japan invaded China, they shackled themselves to a conflict that they were unlikely to win in the short term. Sure, they had huge successes at the start, but then the war practically stalemated. There were more than 6 Chinese for every Japanese, while nations like the Soviets, Britain, France and America were all doing their best to keep the Chinese supplied in their fight, ensuring that they could keep going. But then, Japan got incredibly lucky. Germany would start a conflict in Europe. International attention would drift away from Japan as France got occupied. Britain got bombed and the Soviets got invaded. That just left one nation watching the conflict in China. Japan was also swift to start taking advantage of this German victory. They would pressure the French regime into handing over Indochina. First, by claiming influence in the north, ensuring the region couldn't supply the Chinese, and then by seizing the rest. This was a bridge too far for American leadership. By now, most of America was already anticipating a war against Japan in the near future, as Japanese expansionism was basically destined to interfere with America's interest in the Pacific. They had already put limited trading restrictions on Japan due to the war in China, but the occupation of Indochina ignited an unprecedented sanction package. The import of most American metals, as well as oil, was prohibited, both areas where Japan was completely dependent on the US, while Japanese assets within the US were frozen. The effects of these sanctions were absolutely catastrophic for Japan. They had already not necessarily been in the best economic position ever since the Great Depression. This economic downturn had in fact been a major reason for the militaristic takeover of the nation. But the American embargo was significant in threatening to make things infinitely worse. 95% of Japanese copper came from the US, about 70% of scrap metals, and most importantly, about 94% of their oil. Japan would be issued an ultimatum: leave Indochina and leave your occupations in China, with, depending on who you ask, Manchuria excluded. Several in Japan were interested in accepting, realizing it was the only sensible option in the situation. But the military leadership, and especially Tojo, arguably the most powerful man in Japan at the time, were not. This would represent a huge embarrassment to the Japanese, essentially amounting to capitulating their pan-Asiatic ambitions and resigning themselves to being a practical American puppet. Thus, the American ultimatum was rejected, and there was only one other course for Japan to take. They needed to invade the Dutch East Indies to seize their oil. Now, America had made it abundantly clear: we will try to get involved if you do that. And even if they didn't, the Philippines were such a crucial territory standing between Japan and Indonesia, it would be so immensely difficult for Japan not to accidentally drag the US in the conflict one way or another. For these reasons, I would give the no Pearl Harbor option about a 3 on the realism scale. It would have required immense foresight from the Japanese to not anger the Americans enough to eventually put in an embargo. You'd need to either fundamentally change Japan to not have them be militaristic and at war with China, or you'd need to have them somehow realize that invading Indochina would be a red line for America. This is difficult for a number of reasons. It represented an easy capture, the humiliation of a colonial power, increasing Japanese power, while it also provided a way for Japan to break the stalemate in China by taking charge of the air bases of the region. Besides, even if we have Japan not fully invade Indochina, while it would absolutely delay America's embargo and thus participation in the war, it is unclear if it would actually fully prevent it. America wasn't a huge fan of the war in China in general, and as early as 1938 started placing sanctions on the Japanese economy. Even without Indochina, it is not unthinkable that the US eventually steps up their sanction regime regardless. Then, as a final point, the most radical elements in Japan did want this war with the West, as some even believed that a strong show of force, like the attack on Pearl Harbor, would so shock these cowardly Americans that it would deter further actions. Some truly hoped that after the incapacitation of the Pacific Fleet, America would just say, "Damn, foiled again," and accept Japanese hegemony over Asia. Most of the routes to truly prevent a Pearl Harbor require a decent rewriting of the Japanese mindset of the time. Now, yet another change I sometimes see suggested concerns Japan choosing yet another alternate course of action. We have discussed that America had threatened Japan concerning a potential invasion of the Dutch East Indies. Yet, what if Japan decided to call the American bluff and declared war on just the Dutch and the British, taking very deliberate care to avoid the Philippines and America's Pacific holdings? Now, on paper, this would make a lot of sense. It avoids confrontation with the Americans while still securing their oil supply. The ball would now lay with the Americans, and whether Roosevelt could actually convince Congress to start a conflict over this matter. But before we discuss the potential American response, let's first discuss why Japan didn't do this. Japan didn't have the power of hindsight that we possess, and America had verbally confirmed their intention to defend the Dutch East Indies. While it might seem tempting to ignore the Philippines, the islands are also a dagger directly into the heart of the rising Japanese Empire. Even just the threat of America joining the war, after having further built up their positions on the islands, would mean that Japan has to worry about America using their air and naval assets on the island to devastate the Japanese supply lines. Is this an acceptable risk? Similarly, the entire reason for Pearl Harbor was the incapacitation of the American Pacific Fleet, restricting America's ability for a quick response to Japanese provocations. Without Pearl Harbor, if America does decide on intervention, the Japanese naval situation would be very significantly worse. Since Japan has no guarantee that America will remain neutral, and Roosevelt government has very clearly threatened intervention, it is debatable if such a risk would actually be worth it. For these reasons, I highly doubt that, despite the plan existing, the Japanese High Command would have ever actually went through with such an operation. The amount of risk that it imposes on the Japanese short and long-term ability to wage war by having to wait on an American response, while America can no longer be surprised, is immense. For this reason, I would put the realism of this scenario at around a 4, maybe a 3. It is possible that Japan decides to go with this gambit, but without the power of hindsight or specific knowledge on America's decision making, I would argue that it is just too risky to invade Southeast Asia without incapacitating the Americans in some capacity. But if they did this, would it work? Well, this is a point to be debated. Despite American threats, there are very significant reasons to believe that they wouldn't be directly acted upon. American public sentiment, while very much pro-Allied, had not reached a point where calls for direct intervention were common. There would be widespread outrage across America, but at least initially, it is unlikely that Roosevelt manages an immediate declaration of war. But first, let's discuss the impact if America does intervene quickly, just because it is easier. If Roosevelt does manage to convince Congress that the invasion of Southeast Asia directly interferes with American interests, perhaps coupled with the loss of American ships around Indonesia and Malaysia at the time, we return to a version of our timeline which is just far worse for the Japanese in every way. There isn't an immediate invasion of the Philippines, while America's Pacific Fleet gets moving. Even if Japan manages to redirect and occupy the Philippines anyways, this would require a last-minute change of plans and end up with a less impressive Japanese blitz. Again, little is fundamentally changed about the conflict, but America has a far more powerful starting position. But even if Roosevelt initially remains at peace, he wouldn't remain inactive. He would push the edges of what he could do without requiring congressional approval for war. Imagine even worse sanctions on Japan, if that's even possible, a military buildup in the Asia-Pacific region, and a reinforcement of positions on the Philippines. Despite all these very public moves, war is not declared. American and Philippine waters are completely closed to Japanese shipping, and it is even possible that Roosevelt starts seeking out confrontation with Japanese fleets around American waters. Minor ones, of course, simply hoping that they can goad the Japanese into a confrontation. Now, in such a situation, imagine the panic slowly setting in to the Japanese high command. Sure, Indonesia is falling, but America is very openly preparing for a war and could strike at any time. It is a ticking time bomb for the Japanese, and I highly doubt that the Japanese high command would have the stomach to simply allow this slow, steady, and efficient American buildup. I think it is highly likely that eventually something would break. This could either come from Asia, but also America is still involved in the Atlantic War, heightening German-American tensions. Either of these conflicts going hot would likely be enough for Roosevelt to manage an intervention against both Axis powers eventually. The details of the war are changed, likely leading to a mild benefit to the Germans due to a later American entry, but a huge detriment to the Japanese due to the longer American buildup. In total, I would rate the impact of this change at around a 6. And remember, we are only judging the German perspective, not the Japanese one. It can definitely be a positive change for Germany, as America's entry is delayed, but it's also not necessarily great, as America is far more powerful and Japan might be defeated even sooner. Some have also argued that Japan could have gotten away with a strike on just the Philippines, America's colony, while ignoring direct American territory. This I highly disagree with. It would basically amount to a similar response in the US as Pearl Harbor would have been. Remember, around 23,000 American soldiers died during the Philippine campaign. With any president like Roosevelt in power, a surprise attack on the Philippines, where American soldiers die, would see the Americans respond by joining the war. But now, once again, the Americans have an intact Pacific fleet to start fighting the Japanese with. But there is another, very underutilized way to try to keep America more isolationist. Arguably, not enough emphasis is placed on the president in power during and before World War II, Roosevelt. Most people, myself included, just blindly accept America's immense support for Britain, even before they joined the war, as, well, that's just the right thing to do, no? Of course, America wants to prevent Britain from falling. Of course, America opposes the horrors that the Germans represent and want to stop it. But is it really that simple? FDR was a really unique president in American history, not just in his influence on American economy or the political system, with an unprecedented 4 terms in office, but also in terms of foreign policy. He was a staunch interventionist and staunch Anglophile, at the right place at the right time. His quick support for Britain, even when the political reality of America made supporting a nation at war difficult, gave a huge incentive for the British to not just continue the fight, confident that they had the most powerful nation on earth at their back, it would also help keep Britain's population fed, their armies equipped, their economy running, their scientists safe, and their fleets sailing. Of course, not everything about Britain's war effort should be reduced as the United States in disguise, but America's impact cannot be ignored either. For example, even under Roosevelt's presidency, 3 neutrality acts had been passed, making the sale and transport to nations at war illegal, whatever the context of the conflict. It was Roosevelt which, even before the war began, proposed a change to these laws, allowing weapons to be sold if the warring nation paid in cash and transported them themselves, thereby alleviating the financial and transportation risk for the US. After the fall of France and the election of 1940, Roosevelt took an even more active stance, trying to convince the public to let America take on the role of arsenal of democracy, aiding the British without getting directly involved themselves. In this process, propaganda was spread showing the Germans as brutes oppressing France, while images of British cities in rubble due to German bombardments were regularly shown. This would eventually culminate into the Land-Lease Scheme of 1941. By this point, public opinion in America had begun shifting. Initially, the American public was okay with just providing aid to Britain, as long as Britain paid and carried the risk. But now, increasingly, the idea of further intervention to save their Anglo brethren across the Atlantic gained more traction. This was good, as by now, Britain was running out of hard cash to pay for weapons. They could have continued purchasing more, but would have to recklessly cannibalize their own economy and assets to do so. Even worse, the Johnson Act of 1934 meant the US government could not lend money to nations which hadn't repaid their World War I debt, which obviously included Britain. Thus, the Lend-Lease Act introduced by Roosevelt was truly radical. It allowed the US government to supply weapons, food and resources to foreign nations without asking for direct payment. The only stipulation was that post-war they should be returned to the US. Of course, considering most aid was to be consumed, used in industry, or destroyed in combat, little was actually ever returned to the US. This Lend-Lease Act truly was a radical moment in American history. So let's now imagine that Roosevelt was not in place. Or we have the same man, but he was just a bit more America-centric, unwilling to so selflessly help the British out. If America had truly wanted to, they could have used this war to completely pluck the British dry. Let them destroy their own economy in order to buy American goods, turning Britain into an economic satellite post-war. They could even try to buy Newfoundland and the Caribbean colonies. Even in such a timeline, where American aid does still flow to Britain, Britain would already be significantly worse off. But we can go further. What if we had a staunch isolationist in office? There were several options, and while, with the way American politics went in our timeline, their victory wasn't likely, it wasn't out of the question either. It doesn't even have to be an isolationist defeating Roosevelt in 1936 or 1940. We could just replace Roosevelt with Al Smith in 1932. Sending American politics into a complete tailspin, or somehow end up with staunch isolationists like Robert A. Taft, or, less likely, Thomas E. Dewey by 1940. Again, the specifics are difficult, but removing or changing Roosevelt would completely alter US politics, and these outcomes are not impossible to occur. What would happen now? Well, from the very start, the Allied war effort would be greatly hampered, assuming the president does not amend the Neutrality Acts. Military goods being purchased from the US was just a complete no-go. This is already a big blow to Britain, but it gets worse. As mentioned, Britain was not even allowed to loan American money to pay for the goods that they would want to purchase, as American food and raw resources were still crucial in keeping the British population and industry into the fight. As the years progress, the British would increasingly struggle to pay the Americans for the goods that they need. This point would come a bit later than in our timeline, as the British would be purchasing less, but the British economy does start to suffer, and their military obviously does too. As for example the Home Guard, soldiers called up to defend the British Isles in case of a German invasion, were mostly armed with weapons purchased from the US. Now, none of this means that Britain is just waltzed over in the initial years of the war, but the negative effects do start to compound to weaken Britain. This is carried over when the Germans invade the Soviet Union. If the US is unwilling to support the British, you can bet that they're unwilling to support the USSR. No Lend-Lease makes its way to the Soviet Union, which gradually wears down their compatibility too. In the initial years, it wouldn't be drastic, but in the long term, the lack of certain raw materials the Soviets lacked, food supplies, especially light, can-sealed food, perfect for the army, and general munitions and clothes, start to wear on the Soviets. Militarily speaking, the worst of it would be the lack of American trucks and tires, which were crucial in upgrading the Soviet logistics system as they lagged behind and were still using horses. Now, it is possible that Pearl Harbor still happens, depending on the president and the Congress, where most isolationists could comfortably see the war in Europe as not our problem, considering the lack of a strong German navy meant that most likely they could do little to threaten the US. This is not necessarily the case for Japan. Japan was far more naval-oriented and posed far more of a direct threat on the Pacific, which even isolationists would recognize as part of America's sphere. For this reason, it is possible that some version of events leading to a Pearl Harbor type attack could still happen. This, though, would only bolster the isolationists regarding Europe. Where Roosevelt would have worked tirelessly to tie the Japanese attack to the Germans, an isolationist president could go the exact opposite way. Now, the little concern that might be shown for the war in Europe could be completely blown away as they direct the entire might of the American industry and navy on punishing who they saw as the only actual threat to America. Again, this would significantly weaken British and Soviet efforts against the Germans. So, however way you slice it, this would be an immensely amazing change for the Germans. Though the specifics are a bit muddied by the fact that we don't know exactly how or who replaced Roosevelt. In terms of somehow getting a staunchly isolationist president, I will give this change around a 3 in terms of realism. By 1940, by far most Americans, even on the Republican side, realized that at least some support for Britain was warranted, even if war with Germany should be avoided at all costs. In terms of impact though, it would easily be a 9 or a 10, one of the few changes that might be enough to lead to a German victory, should they play their cards right against the Soviets and the British. The other option, not necessarily having an isolationist president, but still a figure more reluctant to jump into the war than Roosevelt, probably gets around a 6 or a 7 in terms of realism. It is a very plausible change. But also, the impact would be reduced to around a 7, as someone, at least more open to intervention, could still be moved by German submarine attacks and a Pearl Harbor type event to eventually push America closer to intervention. Speaking of removing FDR, there is a minor point that I've sometimes seen brought up as a way to further weaken the Allies: the assassination of the big 3 Allied leaders at Tehran. I don't really think that this would be all too big of a blow to the Allies, just because this planned assassination would take place in November of 1943, by which point the Allies had long since started to push the Germans back. Still, assassination plans did exist, so let's see what might be accomplished. First, some context. What am I even talking about? Well, in the later stages of World War II, the big 3 Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt, all met up in Tehran, Iran. Here, they discussed war policy, like how the West should open up a front in France, and how to deal with the eventual surrender of Germany and Japan. But Germany had learned of this meeting and considered it a great way to sow discord amongst Allied ranks. So, they were planning how exactly to carry out the assassination, but the German espionage network was quite compromised, and the Soviets quickly caught wind of the plot and would foil it completely. But what if they didn't? What if the Germans actually assassinated the highest ranks of Allied leadership? Does chaos ensue across the Western world? Now first, in terms of realism, the Germans really don't have the infrastructure for such an assassination. Iran was under joint Soviet-British occupation, and the event was obviously highly guarded, as especially Stalin was well known for being paranoid. Besides that, the German espionage network was filled with Western and Soviet spies, so the secrecy of such a huge operation is very difficult to maintain. It is not outside the realm of possibility, but I'd still give the assassination at best a 3 in realism. Realistically, probably lower. Still, what if it had actually happened? Well, in the West, the impact really isn't that big. In 1940, this would have been a huge blow. Churchill is violently removed, crippling British morale at the most important point, potentially allowing the more peace-minded Lord Halifax to take his place. In America, FDR is removed, potentially removing his specific interventionist touch. But by 1943, these considerations really aren't there anymore. For Britain, Churchill's removal might very well be a good thing. He is remembered for his staunch anti-German stance, rallying the nation in favor of the war. But by 1943, this goal had been accomplished. With America and the Soviets in the war, there really was no risk of Britain leaving the conflict anymore. Then, militarily speaking, he wasn't exactly the soundest mind. He openly advocated for several military operations which his high command had to convince him were just not worth the risk, like an invasion of northern Norway and a blind focus on the southern front. even when clear that the Italian campaign was progressing too slowly. Churchill's replacement would be Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party and Britain's post-war Prime Minister. While the details of Britain in the final years of the war would change, Britain's continuation in the war isn't altered. The same is roughly true for the United States. Where Roosevelt's main contribution was steering the US towards an intervention, this has already been achieved. Whoever succeeds him, which in 1943 would be Henry A. Wallace, would not pull America from the war, especially not now that the Axis have assassinated a sitting president. Now, Roosevelt was known to be relatively pro-Soviets, and if Truman was his VP, then things might have changed substantially in history, as he was known to be far tougher on the communists. This could potentially have had ramifications on the post-war map. But Henry Wallace was actually a rather pro-Soviet figure within American politics. Of course, his stint in office and the 1944 election could still fundamentally change America. But again, it is unlikely that broad American participation in the war is altered. The most important assassination, though, was Stalin. Obviously, he was the cornerstone to Soviet politics. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say that it wouldn't function without him, it would absolutely face several very significant complications. Now, don't get me wrong, the Soviets wouldn't suddenly dive into a greed-inspired civil war. Regardless of ambitions, amongst the highest ranks in the USSR, they knew what war they were fighting. Still, the sudden loss of Stalin would weaken the Soviets, at the very least diplomatically, but also in terms of cohesion amongst the elites. I would expect figures like Malenkov, Molotov and Zhukov to be the basis for some form of wartime government, with the full power politics being placed on pause until after the end of the conflict. So in terms of impact, I really can't go higher than a 7, but more likely it's closer to a 6, depending largely on how much the Soviet elites dropped the ball while creating a temporary unity government. But truth is, the war was already lost for the Axis by 1943. The West wouldn't have been fundamentally changed, they are still in Italy, the invasion of France is still incoming, and it's not like Zhukov would suddenly let the Soviet lines in the East break just because Stalin is gone. Even if, somehow, this would set the Allied military back by 2 years, the production of nuclear weapons would soon seal the Germans' fate. This change, quite simply, is too little, too late. That brings us to the very final scenario I want to discuss for this video, an ultra-nationalist America. Now obviously, this is a 1 in terms of realism, if not an absolute 0. Still, I included it because in terms of impact, it is one of the few changes that absolutely, without a doubt in my mind, wins the Germans the war. Essentially, it is the isolationist version of no FDR, but on steroids. Not only will this remove America's potential support for Britain and their preference towards intervention, it would be replaced by some form of American nationalism. It is difficult to say exactly what this might look like, but quite possibly it would be some form of aggressive isolationism, with the Americas and the Pacific being considered the United States' natural sphere of influence. So let's just say something like the business plot of 1933 removes FDR from office and institutes some form of dictatorship. Again, this isn't a realistic timeline. A few years later, as the Germans start rampaging around Europe, what has changed? Well, much like with the no FDR timeline, the British are fighting completely on their own. No weapons are sold, no Lend-Lease, no American ships defending the Atlantic. This, in itself, as discussed before, is already huge for German odds of victory. But something else is also added. An ultranationalist America is far more likely to intervene against the British. Not necessarily in terms of a full war, but even just by pressuring them on economic interest in the Americas, on Canada's independence, on Newfoundland, the Caribbean and Bermuda. This would complicate the war significantly for the British, as these areas are, at the end of the day, completely undefendable for the British in their current situation. Is it worth capitulating to American pressure in the Americas just to continue a struggle against the Germans, which is honestly looking rather hopeless? The odds for a peace deal in Europe, Even one that is disadvantageous to Britain has gone up by tenfold. Even more, despite being mostly isolationist, there is a decent chance that any ultranationalist American leadership is enthusiastic about Germany's war against the Soviets, framing it as a crusade against communism. We could see alternate, lesser scale aid supporting the Germans in their invasion against the Soviets. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that this would make a German victory against the Russians a lot more likely. Over in the Pacific, you might expect me to say Japan rolls over China, allies with America, and destroys Britain, but I seriously doubt that. Like discussed a number of times today, for America, Germany is just no immediate threat, with little overlapping interests. This is just not the case with Japan. An ultranationalist America still cannot allow Japan to roll over the Pacific region, and will desire to protect American interests there. In fact, the ultranationalist regime could even prepare and provoke a war against Japan earlier, as they might consider it an inevitable conflict, with Japan being absolutely destroyed by the American Navy, while Germany is dealing with the Soviets. Very obviously, the impact of such a scenario would be an easy 10 out of 10, as one of the few changes that nearly guarantees a German victory in the conflict, dividing the world between an American and German sphere of influence, with a rump British Empire outcompeted by their rivals. So that about concludes the scenarios I wanted to discuss in this episode. I hope they somehow helped educate you as to the role of America in World War II, why things happened the way it did, and how it influenced German odds of victory. Now don't forget to subscribe, as we still have a lot more to cover, with the next episode dealing with Operation Barbarossa and potential changes to the Eastern Front. Obviously, this is key to any German victory, as above all else, the conquest of Eastern Europe was the objective for the Germans. For now, I will thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you.